take us away.
All right, thank you, Sydney. Hello, for those of us who haven't met, my name is Rick Boger Hawkins. I'm an academic advisor and the transfer advocate at Northwestern Connecticut Community College, a relatively small school, probably about 1,100, 1,200 full-time students in Litchfield County in Connecticut. I've been doing this for going on 6 years, and I find that this is the most rewarding, often most difficult part of my job.
Thanks, Rick. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Christopher Fox. I am the Transfer Success Coordinator at the University of Southern Maine. I've worked in admissions for 15 years, the past 11 of which have been specifically working with Maine community college transfer students, kind of assisting their process in making the transition. So working with admissions, but with official dotted lines and warm hands off to places like prior learning assessment, advising, orientation, some of those other institutional partners. So I am happy to be here and happy to share and happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. And Dan, do you want to finish us off?
Sure, thanks, Cindy. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Connolly from Suffolk University. I'm Managing Associate Director of Undergraduate Admission. I've been at Suffolk for a total of 10 years. Many of you, I recognize a lot of you out there, many of you know, I had an original run at Suffolk for about 8 years, and then I joined Fitchburg State for almost 4 years. Then I came back to Suffolk, and I've been back for the last 2 years. So I've got some experience with both the public and private side, which comes in really handy, certainly when we've developed our new transfer pathways program with the New England Board of Higher Education, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But happy to be here. Looking forward to speaking with everybody.
Thanks, everyone. For those of you who joined us a little late, just a quick update on the way we're going to be handling the session is feel free to type any questions you have throughout in the chat box, but I am going to pull from some of the pre-submitted questions. And with that, we'll start out with our first question, and anyone can chime in first. How have you seen pathways in your state and region or institution benefit students? So anyone wants to take us away?
I can say that for our students at Northwestern and for all students in the Connecticut Community College system, that pathways have been a really big benefit, particularly for two reasons. One of which is it allows students to sort of do an unofficial test of the waters before they go to the 4-year. Some students aren't sure that they're supposed to be students, and some students need to learn to become better students, and those students all get a chance to improve their game at community colleges. And the second part is that they get to do it for much less money than they would having gone directly to a 4-year college. For example, a year at UConn or a year at another big state school or private school. For us, a year costs, including books and tuition and fees, about $6,000. So you can get 2 years of college out of the way for basically at the most a third of the cost of going to a 4-year school. So that's a huge benefit. Every dollar that they spend at our school or in our system is basically, a multiple $5 or $6 at least that they don't have to borrow while they're getting their education.
I'll add in the trend, not only throughout New England, but also throughout the rest of the country, to align general education outcomes. I believe the initial collaborative was called something along the lines of LEAP. Higher ed is one of those things where we all have way too many acronyms for things, and most of them are the same acronym for different programs. So if I've got that one wrong, I apologize, and please feel free somebody to correct me. But I think that concept of unifying general education outcomes, and along with that, the adoption from, at least in my experience, a lot of four-year schools of essentially core curriculum waivers to go along with that, has proven really helpful because it gives students a little bit more freedom in their course selection, especially in a program like a liberal studies or a general studies, without having to worry about direct course by course correlations when they know that they can complete that 32 to 38 roughly block of credits and know that they're going to have at least roughly about a third of their bachelor's degree kind of just checked right off.
And I'll just add in there too, with both parents and students, a lot of times where we're working with students and maybe financially it doesn't work, for them right then and there. And we're able to sort of lay out for them at Suffolk, we've got the guaranteed admission agreement with the Massachusetts community colleges. You're able to lay out, hey, it's more or less a 2+2, and then you can see the wheels sort of turning in the head of the parents. Oh, wait a minute, it's not as complicated as I thought. So if you're able to just lay it out there right in front, so it's as clean as possible, long term, it just makes more sense for the student to be able to pursue that avenue and realize that, oh, I can get to the same destination, just a different route.
Yeah, and with that, I'm going to ask you all maybe to elaborate a little bit from your experience of how these type of either statewide, public or private agreements work in your region, just to give those from other regions kind of a framework of the pathways and options students have.
In Connecticut, we have we have a new program which is called, since we all have acronyms in our lives, and in the state of Connecticut's infinite wisdom, we have DAP, which is dual admission program. We have TAP, which is the program with the state with state colleges and universities. And we have GAP, which is the guaranteed admission program with University of Connecticut. So we have all three of those, and it's a bit confusing, but in the end, they're all, once you figure it out, first of all, you have to figure out that they all exist, which is one of the biggest problems that we have, is letting people know that these things exist. They've been created students have to initiate them for the GAP. With UConn, students semi-initiate the whole process with TAP through our CSCU system when they choose their major, when they are applying. So students, hopefully they know what they want to do and they know what it's called when they're applying, and that's a real big assumption a lot of times. So the students start the ball rolling, but our biggest difficulty is making sure that the ball is rolling in the right direction. I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be what I would say is basically how it works. Student initiated, hopefully the right way.
Yeah, I'll add in Maine, we have, to kind of break it down a little bit more, we've got a similar kind of series. There is statewide agreements between the Maine community college system and the Maine university system, and those are essentially kind of centered around that general education and core curriculum. And then institution by institution, there are the articulation agreements that we're all probably familiar with. There are legally vetted, presidentially signed official memoranda of understanding that says this program articulates this program. And then, there are kind of really program by program and sometimes even institution by program agreements that do some kind of bridging across those. So one of the programs we launched here at USM about two and a half years ago is called Connected Pathways. Because sometimes words show up just as prominently as acronyms, and the word pathways is one we're all going to get tired of pretty quick. But Connected Pathways essentially overlays a guaranteed admission on top of an existing articulation agreement. So these are agreements between USM and our 3 kind of largest feeder community colleges to say if your community college students are finishing an articulated program, moving right into USM, that there is a guaranteed admissions process. And in order to streamline the paper trail of that admissions process, the community college registrars have agreed to utilize the form as both a release of transcript document as well as the student's essentially admissions application, so that we're hopefully streamlining their process. But to Rick's point, notifying students that it exists and encouraging them and finding ways to advertise that is sometimes a bigger challenge.
There's some deep waters on the Massachusetts side of things, and as the public side, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because I'm sure things have changed since that last I worked in it, but I was in many of those mass transfer pathway meetings trying to set up the course equivalencies and getting those program to programs to match. At Suffolk, we tried to mirror what the mass transfer program does, which is guaranteeing admission with a certain GPA, guaranteeing the general education foundation or mass transfer block. And by doing that, we also will include scholarship guarantee, similar to mass transfer, with a certain GPA, doing the tuition waiver. We have the scholarship in place. Obviously, our tuition and fee structure is much different than the state's. But with those pathways, we don't mirror the program to program. We try to match it up more or less with like the associates and match it to whether it's the College of Arts and Sciences or the Sawyer Business School. We try to match it up either way. So an associate's in business is going to match up better with the Sawyer Business School versus an associate's in liberal arts. So, but CAS, pretty much any associates in liberal arts will match into that program. So it's a little bit different in that we don't specify program to program. What I am working on those for the website is to try to put up pathways so that students can go in there and see, major wise what they'd have done and then what they'd have left at Suffolk based off of the major. I am trying to do that. It's obviously a lot of work. I've been trying to work on that for the last couple of years. But once again, with Massachusetts, there's also the Commonwealth commitment that's involved too. And I know as part of a lot of those meetings when they were starting up. So the hope is with this new program with the New England Board of Higher Education, which we're hoping to roll out pretty soon, is that on the private side with many independent and private schools in Massachusetts, that we're going to closely relate to that mass transfer program so that students have more options. So that's exciting there. So hopefully we'll be seeing that soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. And with that, we spurred a couple questions from the group, and one of them, and I think you touched a little bit on this, Dan, but I think people have questions about how these pathways relate to scholarship, tuition discount, any of those things that exist in your state, if anyone wants to speak to that.
Well, I'll start off with the scholarship piece to go in a little more specific. So with Suffolk, with a certain GPA, so 2.8 or higher, students are guaranteed a third off of tuition and fees. The higher the GPA, though, the more scholarship money those students are eligible for. So we can guarantee that money based off of the GPA with an associate's degree program. Students have to finish their associates, and we automatically consider that at the point of admission, and obviously require the final transcript to be sent in. So that scholarship's all up front in the review of the file.
I'll add on the main side, at least at USM, we don't necessarily have tuition differentials as tied to these programs, but many of the four-year schools do award merit-based scholarships to transfer students. Those are often structured similarly to the way that they work for high school students, in that they are tied to a specific GPA or a sliding scale of GPA. Obviously, that GPA takes into account college, not necessarily their high school. But as far as I'm aware, the only program that we have that has something specific to the program is we launched a scholarship 3 years ago that gets awarded to any incoming transfer who has completed any associate's degree from a Maine community college, regardless of their GPA. So if you've got the piece of paper coming in the door, you're guaranteed a specific scholarship. And then if you qualify for a merit scholarship that is of a higher award amount, that essentially takes the place of the other. So we're not necessarily double awarding students, but we are giving the higher award amount as we can.
Within the state of Connecticut, within the TAP program, which is at the CSCU, for students who are transferring to a CSCU 4-year, the only money that is generally available is need-based financial aid. There might be some specific scholarships based upon GPA, but they're not available to everybody who comes across from a community college to a CSCU. However, with GAP, University of Connecticut, they've had what are called the president-to-president scholarships, which are $2,000 a semester for each of the 4 semesters that a student will have approximately, they'll need to complete their degree when they transfer as juniors. And that's in addition also to any need-based aid. As I tell the students, it's not a ton of money, but basically it's half a car that you won't have to borrow and never get to drive, which is the way that I have to put things for mostly for male advisees to have it make sense for them to go, oh yeah, that's worth it. And it is worth it. That's really the only scholarship form of aid that is set if you complete your degree here.
I'll add in one more, looking at some of the questions that have come up in the chat and tied to this. Nothing is official yet. We're still in negotiations, but we do have a couple of articulation agreements that exist with institutions outside of Maine. So they're essentially cross-state articulation agreements. And in one particular case, we're not even quite at the point we're ready to sign yet, so I won't necessarily name names, but we are working with another institution where not only will we have an articulation agreement of associate's degree to bachelor's degree, but tied to that will be a guarantee that those students coming from that particular out-of-state community college will be awarded in-state tuition. That's a big deal, and it's one of those things where, because it's a big deal, it's going to rise through the ranks and go through, president's cabinet and system legal and some other folks before officially it gets announced and signed and spread to the world. But those things are certainly coming down the pike. So I think it's a great question to ask, because those ideas are starting to percolate out.
Any other institutions doing anything outside of state other than that? That seems pretty kind of innovative. Chris, I don't know if anything, Dan, you or Rick know anything about that. So it's a good trend that people should look into, especially if you are an institution that's near a state line, right? Kind of expanding your reach out.
If you're near a state line like we are, we're still far away from things, but we're near a state line, which can make a big difference with students who are looking at Westfield as opposed to Central. Basically, they're equidistant, and the opportunities can be different. It means that the student has to do a lot more legwork on their own, because I'm not necessarily familiar with any or much of the mass transfers involved type of details. But it does help to be near a state line.
Absolutely.
And I'll add that as a school that participates with the New England Board of Higher Education tuition break program, we don't have any kind of specialized programs for transfers, but we also don't exclude transfers. So if you're a student who qualifies for that program just based on your home state residency, and you also happen to be a transfer, you're still going to get that same, NEBI rate, regardless of whether you're first year or transfer. That doesn't necessarily make a difference. So we will honor that.
And I think Tuition Break is one of those programs that's a fantastic opportunity that is really, that can be quite difficult to get the word out about, particularly since it's so specific to major. It just takes, it's an extra step or two, just getting the student to the place where they find out about it. But once they find out about it, we've had many students who've gone to Maine for forestry, for example. It's a really helpful, nice program. I must add that in our system, things are more complicated right now, just generally speaking, because of we're trying to consolidate our community colleges and our four-year schools into one system, which means that everything is up in the air. For example, we now have I believe, an assistant vice president of transfer and articulation, who is working for the first time with transfer advisors. So in our system, unfortunately, what often happens is things just fall out of the sky. Directives, transfer requirements, things like this. Curriculum changes being the biggest changes that just drop out of the sky. But anything, so hopefully in 3.5 years, this will all be fixed. But right now it's everything is just very much in flux.
I think that's a good point to make. I know it's one that we've faced a couple of times in Maine, where there are folks often outside of higher ed who have some ideas on how they think things should be run. And so sometimes there may be directives from the governor's level or the state legislature level that could have really specific outcomes, I should say, for students. And sometimes, they're a bigger deal for the other side of the house. We had a example a couple of years ago where our legislature tried to mandate unified course numbering across the university system as well as the community college system, which is a really great idea, but kind of was a little triggering for some faculty who believe that course numbering should fall under the control of themselves and their senates. So there's those kinds of things that you wouldn't imagine to be a problem and becomes, a control issue. But then there are others that, we've got a really great representatives at our university system office and our community college system office who work really well together and who do actively reach out to, myself and my colleagues around both systems to say, hey, we've got this idea. What do you all think? Would you be willing, to collaborate with us? And so I think we're lucky in that we've got some really great people in some really great positions. But sometimes we can't get meetings with those people because they have to go, talk to the legislature about how micromanaging education is sometimes not the best idea.
Absolutely. There's always a lot of moving parts there. I want to bring it to one quick question in the chat and then kind of go back out to the submitted questions, because I have an answer to one of your questions about any other private institutions doing something similar to Suffolk. Well, prior to working at UMass Boston, I worked at Simmons in Boston and actually kind of stole Suffolk's idea a little bit. So it was very successful. And we did something similar where we increased our scholarship opportunities for students completing associate degrees from Massachusetts community colleges, as well as honoring the Mass Transfer Block or Gen Ed Foundation for our core. It's only in its second year, and I don't work there anymore, so I don't know exactly how it functions, but I do know that's something that we were working on there to kind of help. And then I also saw in the chat that St. Michael's has aligned transfer merit for first year and transfers. Yeah, awesome. So one thing I do want to loop out to, I know we've been talking about a lot of different ideas, but one of the questions that I thought was really important to bring to the group is, I know there's some people who are thinking, I might be at a private institution or public that doesn't have as many pathways. Where do I start? It feels like a really overwhelming process. And I know there's a lot of stakeholders involved, but could you maybe speak to how something like this starts? What's your role in facilitating a pathway? What's the role of faculty and other kind of stakeholders that participate in this process? Big question.
I'll start. At Suffolk, I being a private school, the we have the curriculum. It's 54 credits is our general education foundation curriculum. And obviously with the state side of things, it's much less, around 34, I believe, if I'm thinking of the right number off the top of my head. But for us, what it came down to was having that buy-in from senior administration at the dean level, provost level, and then being able to sort of filter that down to the departments to be able to get them on board, to be able to take certain credit, to be able to do waivers and substitutions in certain areas. So that was huge for us. So luckily we had always had that transfer friendly environment. So when we tried to do the guaranteed admission pathway for all the community colleges, it was having that buy-in from that senior level and communicating that with faculty, because from an admissions side, I don't think we would have been able to get the momentum we needed on the faculty side without that buy-in at the top. So that was crucial for us to have them working directly with admissions to be able to spread the word and be able to get everybody on board. So that's where I would start, is at the chief academic officer, provost level, to see if there's a meeting that could be broached to be able to get that off the ground.
I'll share from the direct student service perspective. I have kind of gone both directions, where I work really closely with our Office of Academic Partnerships and our provost, and getting faculty on both institutions to come together and build articulation agreements. Those are great. One of the downsides of those is sometimes they sit on a shelf and they don't get updated and they don't get looked at all that often. And so, I really look at my work as a form of advising, and really thinking about my work from that student service perspective. And so I actually spent, when I started, this position was actually, created, and really looked at building it from the ground up. It was a little bit of building a plane as we fly it, but I spent about 1.5 years officially under admissions umbrella, but physically located within the advising suite. And so, to borrow the journalism and military model, I was embedded within advising. And what I was really able to do was partner with them, get a really great concept as to how advising at USM works, and to see what I could beg, borrow, and steal from that to then inform my work with pre-transfer advising for incoming transfer students. And so one of the things that I do in my work, with my community college students is, to take that advising model where we sit down and say, okay, what are your longer term plans as well as your shorter term plans? And can I help you navigate making the best course selections to take advantage of, if not a full articulation agreement, or if one doesn't exist for your intended program at both schools, can I create essentially an individualized transfer pathway, what we call an unofficial transfer credit evaluation and recommendations. Say, okay, if you're thinking about doing this program and we don't have a standing agreement for this other one, can I build that roadmap for you and make some recommendations, always with the umbrella that it's unofficial because you haven't applied and been admitted yet, and that you should probably vet all of those through your home institution's academic advisor, because they're really the experts at your 2-year institution. And taking that student services approach, I think, has really helped students feel welcome, feel that transfer is a puzzle that's easier to navigate. How's that for mixed metaphors? And one of the things that I've also found is, to work around the challenges with articulation agreements. Oftentimes what I'm doing is creating transfer guides, which are essentially a list of recommended courses. So they don't have to be approved. They don't have to go through the faculty and legal and presidential signing process. They can just be a sequence of recommended courses. And using our own advising worksheets and our transfer tables to build that out. Say, if you're thinking about this option, here's what that might look like. And so one of the ideas that we're, again, discussing institutionally right now is, do we expand upon that and transition away from static articulation agreements and move toward transfer guides that are a little bit more dynamic?
One thing that we have had is, I am clearly on the student services side of this. when it comes to making or initiating or any sort of policy. And traditionally, transfer counselors within our system have been the last to know, which has been really exceedingly frustrating. When, for example, our TAP, our transfer program, we were called to a meeting probably like 4 years ago, and we were told, here it is. And with the preface, believe it or not, that we want to make this so that students will never have to see an academic advisor. That was rolled out there for all of us, and we were just like, wow, that's a bummer. So it started out on a bad foot, but it never had involvement from us to begin with. So articulation programs or programs were created that would require higher levels of classes at the 2-year degree than for students who were transferring to Central, for example, for a 4-year degree. And all of these were types of things that could have been avoided with more people who were on the ground advising students and knew the transfer schools and knew the programs and knew the people who knew the people, as opposed to plop, falls out of the sky, here you go. But I think that's one of the things that we're involved in, achieving the dream right now. And one of the hugest realizations is that we need to figure out ways to, when it comes to transfer and academic advising, we need to figure out ways to get faculty and professional advisors on the same page. Because never are they forced to be in the same room doing the same thing, let alone, working together. And so students can get advice from 3 different people with that they're slightly different, 3 different advices. And between working with faculty and working as a team and focusing on the handoff, anytime you're moving a student from one department to another, we traditionally have been very weak at that. And we're discovering that that's where the money is the handoff and the teamwork. Just an aside.
Thanks for that, Rick, because it kind of brings to the question that I wanted to talk about, were some of the things that as you began some of these pathways, some unintended consequences or best practices. And I think Rick already pointed to something not to do. Make sure you're incorporating all of the important stakeholders in the conversation, right? The people with the boots on the ground. I think a lot of us are biased because we are those people, know how this impacts students directly. But maybe if Dan or Chris could speak to not negatives of having pathways, but maybe something that's been kind of pain points that you experience or recommendations for individuals of what to avoid.
I'm trying to think. Ultimately, one of the challenges is that, I mean, just from a logistics standpoint, is course numbers. Like we just changed government to political science, so all the course numbers changed for government, and of course we've got all these equivalencies saved in our database. With GVT course numbers, and I've got to change them out to POLS, and there's no batch way to do it. So I've got to go in there and physically update each course. So, but that wasn't communicated until it actually happened. So, that type of little things that can be kind of those pain points where, the faculty aren't always thinking about the transfer side of things. So that's one of those that I'm constantly, I'm trying to figure out a way to get everybody to think that way, but obviously that's easier said than done. But so like I met with the criminal justice department head, and we talked about the course numbers changing there because that used to be a concentration, now it's a full-blown major. So those types of things, it's just making sure everybody realizes the impact of those seemingly small changes and how that can really impact everything going forward. So the registrar is really good though about putting in equivalencies for the previous course number, and it would still count. So a student like who came in for this fall was still getting credit for the course, even though the course number was updated. They're still getting credit for that. So having the registrar on board was another thing that whenever we do any changes, we make sure to communicate with them too. That's a department that we always make sure we're in constant contact with.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Getting to know your provost, and if you have multiple colleges, your collegiate deans, if not your academic department chairs, and getting to know them well can help provide those kinds of institutional partnership moments. And I can share two quick examples. Our biology department changed their curriculum for anatomy and physiology for our human biology majors, which is essentially our pre-med program, as opposed to kind of our other healthcare aligned programs. And what that did was essentially offset transfer students who'd been planning to come into that major because suddenly their community college A&P courses didn't exactly line up. And that was a curriculum change. So it wasn't just a matter of changing the course number, it was an actual outcomes change. And like it's been said, that kind of dropped out of the sky on us, and we did our best to work through it and help students through it. But we also kind of let it be known that that was going to result in some problematic transfer numbers, for their incoming year. And that, I think when those numbers came in, that kind of hit them about, okay, yeah, we need to think this through. And they shared that with their peers. So a couple of years later, when our School of Business, really overhauled all of their business majors and did some better alignment, between their majors, when they first started those discussions, they actually pulled myself and one or two of my colleagues in to say, hey, this is what we're thinking about. Help us think through what are the potential outcomes for transfers. And, I was able to say, yep, and walk through the if-then scenarios. Say, yep, these kinds of changes are going to make this result. These kinds of changes, are not going to have negative results, are going to have really positive results. And so to work through that, and it also really helped me understand that those kinds of curricular changes are not just data driven, but are often driven by things that are not necessarily on my radar. With our School of Business, there were changes that were driven by their advanced accreditation. They were outcomes that were changing based on, the work that's happening in the field. A basic spreadsheets course isn't really helpful if students are being asked to do more high-end data analytics. And so making those kinds of course by course changes are really driven by the career field as well. So getting to build those really warm partnerships with those folks is really helpful, because it means you're going to be one of those foremost people in their mind to come forward when they're thinking about those changes, rather than dealing with the fallout when they happen.
Thank you. I think the name of the game is knowing people, and having those relationship building seems to be really essential in this type of work. We've had a couple of questions come up in the chat that I want to, and comments that I want to bring attention to. First off, a question that I thought was interesting is the topic of elective credits. I think that's probably, it's on my mind all the time, that as we try to align these pieces and we say a certain amount of credits come in, what do those credits come in for, and how has that been accounted for in your programs, if anyone wants to speak to that?
With elective credit, that it comes in handy for us for sure. I mean, ultimately, students sometimes have a hard time dealing with that when they see free elective as the equivalent. But that can really fill in for those missing credits that might happen as a result of us being on a 4-credit system with our College of Arts and Sciences. So oftentimes these courses are coming in as 3 credits. There's that floating credit that still needs to be satisfied. That's where that free elective can really come into play to get the students towards their ultimate goal of 126 credits to graduate in the College of Arts and Sciences and 124 credits to graduate in the Sawyer Business School. So it's a challenge to try to communicate that, because students want to see a specific course to be satisfied. For us, we'll also, as I mentioned before, we do substitution. So we have names for different requirements. So for like the human behavior requirement, it's HBS Rec. For the visual and performing arts requirements, CAS VPATH. So those will satisfy those, requirements in place. And once again, that takes some explanation too with students. And so we try to do as clean a job as possible to describe all those things at the point of admission with our degree evaluation. But electives can be tricky because when they see that, they think that that credit is being lost, but it's not, because it's oftentimes filling in those gaps that happen as a result of waivers that we might be doing, or as I mentioned with that 3 credits versus 4 credits. So it definitely comes in handy.
I really try my best to give students a heads up on what that's going to look like before they even apply. So when I do those unofficial evaluations, it's showing them that, you know, their courses are going to fall into those 3 big categories. They're either general electives or core curriculum. They're specific to their major, or they're this third kind of catch-all category of free electives. And those, with a small handful of exceptions, you know, those are not lost credits. Like you said, those are simply a different piece to the puzzle, you know, and not a whole lot of students are surprised when those small handful exceptions are things like, you know, engineering or nursing or music that are very cohort based, and tend to be, you know, significantly credit heavy within the major itself. But again, I find that the best thing to do is really let students know as early as possible, so they're coming in anticipating, you know, those different categories, not necessarily trying to figure it out between getting the admit letter and registering for courses their first semester.
And that kind of brings me to a question that was submitted about what this looks like on the community college side. Rick, you talked about this a little bit earlier, that students sometimes, you know, have to opt in early and take advantage of things, but I'm hoping you can speak to how to advise students in terms of what pathway to pick, whether career-oriented, transfer-oriented, so that they can maximize their credits and not have as many electives. But I mean, of course, we know that those can still be helpful.
Well, I think one thing that most counselors do that makes it a little bit easier is if a student isn't sure what they're trying to do, you try to buy them some time, so that they can come to a firmer decision about what they want to do. And the way to do that is to make sure that students are taking their math, taking their English, taking their behavioral sciences, taking an art course, something that at least for a semester, you know that they're all going to transfer, assuming that the grade is good enough. And then you can schedule a time to meet with them to find out what do you want to do, and then have them come to a realization with you that they need to follow a more specific, after this semester, they need to really look ahead. They need to be planning and doing advising. I need to be doing advising with my eye on 2 places, here at the community college and then at, say, UConn, which is really good because for GAP, for example, at UConn, students, I meet with all of the GAP students because the faculty just doesn't have the specialized knowledge of the UConn curriculum that I do. But students need to get into the GAP before they have 30 credits. And it's not uncommon for students to come in with like 33 credits and ask me if they can go, and they can't. One really delicate area in our system right now is how do you advise students who are in sort of pre-professional pathways, like we don't call it pre, but like social work studies, or social work studies is one of the hardest, and business, where students assume that just because they get the associates in business, or if they get the associates in social work, for example, that it's smooth sailing to the bachelor's in social work. We have a system right now where students can get the associates in social work, but theoretically not get into the bachelor's of social work program at one of the CSCU schools. And so that's something that's pretty shocking. Students don't necessarily understand the difference between admissible GPAs, like having a 2.7 for nursing. We tell students you got to have the minimum admissible GPA at 2.7, and students are like, I get students who come into my office all the time who are like, well, Rick, I got the 2.7, bring on nursing school. And then you tell them, you know, the median GPA of an accepted student is about 3.6 or a 3.7. And when you have to break that news, that's, they needed to hear that a lot earlier. And if there's going to be another application step after getting the associates in a specific field to get admitted to the school at the 4-year level, students need to know that soon. And we need to do a much better job of either publicizing that or just not having an AS as a professional degree, so that we don't lead students on.
I can share in Maine, one of the things that's happened slowly over the last roughly 10 to 15 years is that there's really been an embrace of the career development process as a process. And a lot of that has been built into not only the college advising process in high schools, but also the kind of first year experience or freshman seminar course at a lot of our, if not all of our community colleges, so that students who may be coming in genuinely undeclared or undecided, you know, are getting guidance along the way to help them really understand how to work through that, how to find for themselves where their strengths, where their weaknesses, where their interests. And, you know, to Rick's point, what is the real educational journey to get to where they want to go? You know, you can't be a clinical psychiatrist with an associate's degree. You're going to have to go on, and what's the best pathway to get you there? And so those messages are really being, you know, pushed out to students early on, which is really helpful. I know one of the things that I really try to do within my own office is to encourage my peers who work on the high school recruitment side to engage their school counseling partners, you know, in having those same conversations. So hopefully that messaging trickles down a little bit so that the parents are getting, hopefully their heads away from the historical stigma that sometimes 2-year colleges have faced, especially if they've been given technical college names in the past. But also to kind of get through that messaging that starting off college by saving money is not a bad thing, and it's not anything to be ashamed of. It's actually really smart in today's market, and kind of pushing some of those messages out as early as possible as well, so that by the time students have come around to then meeting with folks like Dan and I, that's not a new concept we're sharing. And unfortunately, it is often new, especially when working with, you know, adult clients. You know, I have my share of guys who are 40, 50 plus who've been working at, you know, Bath Iron Works and are now ready to change careers. And going through that is a very interesting conversation. But it's a different conversation than, you know, the more traditional 20, 21-year-old transfer student coming out of the community colleges.
As you can see, I'm sorry, my cat was body slamming the door to join the webinar, and I had to let him in. But there's always some comic relief, right? I thought he would be able to make it, but he couldn't. Thank you all for that. I know that we only have about 10 minutes left, but I do want to circle to an interesting topic. If anyone can speak to military credit and how that fits in, if it fits in for stuff like this for students.
I can jump in on this one because I have a lot of experience working with students coming in with military credit. Depending on what their background has been, obviously what that credit looks like is a little bit different. At USM, we don't have any caps on incoming credits. So essentially, if it's transferable, we accept everything, you know, and then the complex process becomes, well, where do we put it? What do we do with those credits? Military credit, for many majors, ends up falling into that free elective category. But we do have a handful of programs who've really embraced it and are willing to award major-based credit. To be honest, those tend to be things like technology management, where we're recognizing they've got a background in a technical aspect, and now we're building the management piece on top of it. We also have a leadership studies program, which really recognizes the kinds of leadership that folks are learning in the military and recognizing that as one of many leadership styles, and are willing to award those credits within their major. But one of the things that we did, again, probably about 10 or 12 years ago, was recognizing that there had been a shift in the higher ed dynamic, that many students were not necessarily looking for a degree to have the piece of paper, but were looking for a pathway toward a career. And that shift, towards finding the shortest, fastest, cheapest pathway was significantly impacting, transfers who were having way more free electives than they needed. And so we had a small handful of academic departments who really looked over their own programs and created degree completion pathways, which limited the number of specifically required major courses and opened up the capacity for either departmental electives and/or free electives. And those have been really helpful for folks coming in with all kinds of military credits, whether they be, JST or CCAF, because they are more willing to look at the content of those and apply them in one space or the other.
So to just piggyback off of Chris, and we do very similar in that most of the time it's free elective, but occasionally it's the department elective, or it can satisfy one of the core requirements. I've seen business organizational behavior come in with the leadership. So it can vary depending on, as Chris mentioned, like that major piece. One thing I will say, sometimes we are giving more credit versus what the community college was able to give for credit, in terms of that free elective capacity too, which can help in their overall goal to graduate, in a certain time frame. So we always ask for the specific transcript to come directly from the JST website, so that we can make sure that we're given the appropriate credit when possible.
Thanks, everyone. And kind of one of the final questions I want to pitch, because I think it ties it all together. One of the points Rick was mentioning was, getting this information to students earlier, advertising these pathways and programs. I know, Dan, you were talking earlier about updating your website. Any best practices for getting the word out about articulations, pathways, so that students hear about this information early and often?
I'll jump in because it's one of those pieces where the buzzword of the field kind of dovetailed with my practice, and data-driven decision making was, we went to our marketing folks and said, hey, we need to do more marketing specifically around transfers. And they kind of said, well, that's not worth our time because they're not such a big deal. And so pulling that data to go back and say, yes, transfers are between 40 and 50% of our incoming population, and a higher percentage of our persisting population, was really the eye opener for a marketing team, which had historically been really pointed and focused at high school marketing, to say, oh, wow, okay, there really is, an ROI on transfer marketing. And so, yeah, and that data was enough for them to say, okay, let's create a separate communication pathway. Let's really build some really amazing transfer pieces. And let's start hosting, information sessions and really better design the website so that transfer information is now 3 or 4 clicks deep instead of 12 or 15 clicks deep.
That, just to go along with what Chris was saying, that the web presence, it was key for us, just making sure it was accessible, within a couple of clicks, not as Chris mentioned, not, deep within the site, and how do you find it? It's right up front. We've got our own redirect now with the suffolk.edu/transfer. And in all of our email communication is separate for transfer versus, we'll see some overlap with freshman transfer communication, but most of the time it's separate transfer communication. So for instance, the admitted student population, they're getting a different comp plan versus the freshmen because they get to register earlier than the freshmen. Prior to orientation, they can do one-on-one appointments with advising. So we've brought advising in, and they're helping more in terms of outreach too with the deposited population. So it's just doing those extra little, steps, which add up to something a little bit bigger to make sure that the transfers are welcome.
The advice that I would give is, if you have the ability, if you're at a community college, get to know your institutional research director or an IR person. It's so I couldn't do my job without, first of all, at the beginning of the semester, figuring out what number of credits I want students to have that I'm going to be able to, that I'm going to approach. If you have any way of identifying students by whether they want to transfer, be it before they graduate or after they graduate with their associate's degree, your IR person can help you get a list of those people. And then using Constant Contact like we do here, you can hit that list early, and then you can do a monthly follow-up of everybody. Sometimes it can be a bit unwieldy after the first semester. You have, if you've pulled everybody who has 15 credits or more, that just gets to be a bigger group. So you end up sending out 500 if you're me at a small school. Half the school's getting an email saying think about transfer, but the IR person is the person who can make that all happen. Plus know and sit down and really formulate a plan. Who do you want to contact and when? At our school, because we're so small, there has been in the past there's been a perception that anybody I encourage to transfer is going to leave without graduating. And that at a small school with small programs, if somebody is going to view me as somebody whose job is to take away their students in their program, that can lead to some real issues that can really affect the transfer office negatively in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there's definitely a delicate balance there. I want to be mindful. We've just reached the 12 o'clock hour. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. I know there's some great questions still sitting in the chat. And so I apologize we're not able to get to them, but I want to thank our panelists for all of their insight and perspective today. I think this was really helpful. And thank you to everyone for your engagement and your questions. We're glad you joined us. And our plug is to join us for the NETA Holiday Social. Okay, Carolyn, you're gonna help me out. It's Rick, the 17th at 5 p.m. Am I right?
Yep. Yeah. And we're going to be using a cool program that we just got a demo on. So I'm very excited. Trivia is back and it's better than ever. So I see, I'm looking at you, Doug, obviously, yeah, you love it.
And there might be a holiday sweater background contest. So we'll be getting the invite out later this week, but we really hope you can join us for some kind of fun kickback and join your NETA colleagues. But thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the first day of December.
Thanks, everyone.